I used to think God had forgotten about people like me until the night heaven fell into the desert and proved I'd been part of the plan all along. My name is Daniel Reed, and before that night, I was just a struggling mechanic in a town so small it didn't even have a name on most maps. My shop sat at the edge of the Mojave, surrounded by red dust, broken dreams, and the kind of silence that makes you wonder if you matter at all. I'd inherited the place from my father, along with his debts, his regrets, and a faith that had slowly rusted away like the tools hanging on my walls. Every morning I'd wake up to fix engines that barely ran, for people who barely had enough to pay me, and every night I'd stare at the ceiling wondering if this was all my life would ever be. The desert has a way of making you feel invisible, like you're just another grain of sand waiting for the wind to blow you away. I'd stopped praying years ago, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. I simply couldn't see the point anymore. But on that October evening, as the sun bled orange across the canyon ridges behind my shop, something happened that shattered every assumption I'd ever made about myself, about the universe, about God. The sky tore open with a light so brilliant it turned night into noon, and a sound like thunder, mixed with music, roared across the emptiness. I dropped the wrench I was holding and stumbled outside, shielding my eyes, my heart hammering against my ribs as if it recognized something my mind couldn't process yet. In the distance, beyond the ridge where nothing ever happened, a pillar of white fire rose into the darkness, pulsing like a heartbeat, calling to me in a language older than words. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to call someone, to hide, but something deeper, something I'd buried under years of doubt and disappointment, pulled me forward into the desert night. I grabbed a flashlight, my hands trembling, and started walking toward the canyon, my boots crunching over gravel and dried brush, the air thick with ozone and something else, something sweet and electric that made my skin tingle. The closer I got, the more I felt it, a presence, immense and ancient, pressing against my chest like a hand reaching through reality itself. The pillar of light had faded, replaced by a faint glow rising from the canyon floor, flickering like a dying star that had crashed into the earth just for me to find. I don't know why I didn't turn back. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the first whisper of a destiny I'd been running from my entire life. When I reached the edge of the ridge and looked down, my breath caught in my throat. There, half buried in sand and stone, was something that couldn't exist, something that rewrote the rules of everything I thought was real. It was a ship, or what remained of one, twisted metal and crystalline panels glowing with symbols that moved like living water, humming with a frequency I could feel in my bones. Smoke rose in thin silver threads, and the air shimmered as if the fabric of space itself was still healing from the impact. My mind tried to rationalize it: a plane, a satellite, a military experiment, but my soul knew better. I climbed down the rocky slope, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, my pulse so loud I could hear it echoing in my ears. And that's when I saw him. Through a jagged opening in the hull, illuminated by the soft, dying glow of the ship's interior, was a figure unlike anything I'd ever imagined, a being made of light and metal, skin like molten gold threaded with veins of silver, collapsing against the wall as if holding onto life by sheer will. His form was humanoid but impossibly beautiful, as if someone had taken the idea of a man and rebuilt it from starlight and sacred geometry. He turned his head toward me, slowly, painfully, and when our eyes met, I felt the universe tilt beneath my feet. Those eyes held galaxies, entire spirals of stars, and worlds turning in depths I couldn't measure, and in them I saw sorrow, hope, and something that looked terrifyingly close to recognition, as if he'd been waiting for me specifically. His lips moved, cracked and shimmering, and a single word escaped, carried on a breath that smelled like rain and incense and the edge of eternity: help. That word didn't just reach my ears, it pierced my chest, my soul, my every hidden fear and forgotten prayer. And in that moment, standing in the wreckage of something beyond comprehension, I realized my entire life had been leading me here, to this canyon, to this being, to this impossible choice that would change everything I thought I knew about God, Jesus, and the reason I was ever born. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking, every rational part of my brain screaming that this was insane, but something ancient and unshakable rising in my spirit, telling me this was the most important moment of my existence. His hand reached toward me, trembling, fingers like polished bronze trailing light, and when they hovered near my tool belt, I understood. He wasn't asking me to save him with knowledge I didn't have, but with the gifts I'd always taken for granted, my father's tools, worn and ordinary, suddenly felt sacred in my hands, as if they'd been blessed for this exact purpose across generations I couldn't see. I looked into those galaxy eyes again, and though no more words were spoken, I felt a transmission of trust so profound it brought tears to my face, a belief that a forgotten mechanic in a nameless town was exactly who the universe needed in this moment. The ship hummed beneath my touch as I began to work, guided by instinct, intuition, and something that felt disturbingly close to divine inspiration. And I knew with absolute certainty that my life would never, ever be the same. What he would show me in the hours to come would crack open the sky, rewrite scripture in my heart, and reveal the truth about Jesus that even angels had been waiting for someone like me to finally understand. I didn't know what I was doing, but my hands moved with a certainty that didn't belong to me, as if every engine I'd ever fixed, every wire I'd ever soldered, every broken thing I'd ever made whole had been training for this single, impossible task. The technology before me defied logic, crystalline circuits that pulsed with light, metals that seemed to breathe, energy conduits woven through the ship's hull like veins carrying something more than electricity, something that felt closer to consciousness itself. Yet when I touched them, when I let my calloused fingers trace the patterns of damage, I could sense where the breaks were, where the flow had been interrupted, as if the ship was whispering its own pain directly into my nervous system. Sweat dripped down my face, mixing with tears I didn't remember shedding, my tool belt hanging open like a priest's vestments as I worked with pliers, screwdrivers, and duct tape alongside materials that shouldn't exist on Earth. The being watched me with those impossible eyes, his breathing shallow and rhythmic, each exhale releasing tiny motes of light that drifted upward and dissolved like prayers reaching heaven. I could feel him weakening, his luminescence dimming with every passing minute, and a desperate urgency flooded through me not just to save his life, but to preserve whatever truth he carried, whatever message had been worth crossing the stars to deliver. Time became meaningless in that glowing wreckage. Seconds stretched into eternities and hours collapsed into heartbeats as I reconnected pathways I couldn't name, sealed fractures in materials I couldn't identify, and somehow, impossibly, began to see the ship not as alien machinery but as a kind of body, a living extension of the being who piloted it. My mind kept returning to something my father once told me while teaching me to rebuild carburetors in this very desert, that everything broken wants to be whole again, that creation itself bends toward restoration, that fixing things is the closest we come to participating in God's original intent. I dismissed it as old man philosophy back then, but now, with my hands buried in technology from another world, those words rang through me like cathedral bells, and I understood that repair itself was a form of worship, a declaration that brokenness is not the final word. The ship responded to my touch, to my intention, to something deeper than skill. It responded to faith I didn't even know I still possessed. Buried under years of disappointment and dust, a low hum began to vibrate through the hull, soft at first, then building like the first notes of a symphony that had been silent for too long, and the symbols on the walls flared brighter, swirling faster, as if awakening from a sleep that could have been death. The moment the central core ignited with a pure, singing tone that I felt in my teeth and my chest and the base of my spine. The being's eyes snapped fully open, blazing with renewed light, and he moved toward me with a speed that should have terrified me, but instead felt like coming home. His hand warm, solid, impossibly real, pressed against my chest directly over my heart, and the world exploded into silence so complete it was louder than any sound I'd ever heard. Every noise ceased, the hum of the ship, the whisper of desert wind, the ragged gasping of my own breath. Even the blood rushing through my veins went quiet, as if all of creation had paused to witness what came next. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stand there as his palm burned against my sternum, not with heat but with presence, with a weight of meaning so vast I thought my ribs might crack open to contain it. His eyes locked onto mine, and I stopped being Daniel Reed, struggling mechanic from nowhere. I became transparent, every memory, every failure, every secret shame and hidden hope laid bare before a gaze that saw not just who I was but who I'd been created to become. Tears poured down my face without permission, my throat tight with emotions I had no names for, and in that infinite moment of silence, I heard him, not with my ears but with something deeper, a voice that resonated in the architecture of my soul. "You have saved more than a life, Daniel Reed." The words formed inside me, each syllable carrying layers of meaning my mind struggled to unpack. You have proven what I was sent to remember, that the image of God lives in the smallest acts of love, that divinity flows through ordinary hands when they choose to heal rather than harm, to build rather than abandon. His hand remained pressed against my heart, and I felt something transfer. Between us, a current of knowledge that bypassed language entirely, flooding into me like light into a room that had been dark for decades. I gasped as fragmented images cascaded through my consciousness, ancient worlds, beings of light gathered in councils that predated Earth's formation, and at the center of it all, a plan so beautiful and terrible it made me weep harder, a plan that somehow involved this desert, this night, and a truth about Jesus that most of humanity had forgotten or never fully understood. When he finally removed his hand, I collapsed to my knees, lungs burning as sound rushed back into reality, the ship humming around us like a living temple, and I knew with absolute certainty that everything I thought I'd lost, my faith, my purpose, my connection to the divine, had never left me at all, but had been waiting in silence for this exact moment, when heaven would crash into the desert and remember me back into the story I was always meant to tell. I couldn't catch my breath, couldn't stop the trembling that had taken over my entire body as I knelt there on the floor of that impossible ship, the hum of its restored systems vibrating through my bones like a second heartbeat. A Rowan stood before me, no longer dying but radiant with a light that didn't hurt to look at, a luminescence that somehow felt familiar, like the glow of sunset through stained glass windows in the church my grandmother used to take me to before the world convinced me that faith was for people who couldn't handle reality. But this was reality, more real than anything I'd ever touched, more solid than the ground beneath my knees, more true than every cynical thought I'd wrapped around my heart like armor against disappointment. He watched me with those galaxy-filled eyes, patient and kind, waiting for me to find my voice, waiting for me to ask the questions that were piling up in my throat like stones. Finally, I managed to whisper, my voice cracked and small, "What are you?" And he smiled, a gesture so unexpectedly human it made fresh tears spill down my cheeks, before answering in that voice that resonated inside and outside simultaneously. "I am Iroan, a watcher, one of many sent to bear witness to the greatest love story ever told." The words hung in the air between us, shimmering with significance I couldn't quite grasp, and I shook my head, confusion mixing with the awe that had taken up permanent residence in my chest. "A watcher," I repeated, tasting the word, feeling its weight. "You've been watching Earth, watching us, but why? What could we possibly matter to beings who cross galaxies in ships made of light and metal?" A Rowan moved closer, and the ship responded to him, the walls shifting colors, the symbols flowing like liquid scripture around us, creating patterns that felt almost like language, almost like prayer. "You matter, Daniel, because humanity holds within its fragile flesh the answer to a question that has haunted creation. Since before your sun ignited, can the infinite love of God bridge the gap between divinity and mortality? Can the Creator enter creation without destroying it? Can love truly conquer the entropy that devours worlds?" His hand gestured to the space around us, and suddenly I understood that this ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a sanctuary, a mobile temple built to carry sacred truth across the darkness between stars. My kind has existed for ages beyond your counting, witnessing the birth and death of galaxies, and yet we have never seen what we saw here, on this small blue world, 2,000 years ago. My mind reeled, trying to process what he was suggesting, and I heard myself say, "Jesus," the name falling from my lips with a reverence I thought I'd lost. Somewhere between my father's funeral and my divorce, between the slow death of dreams and the desperate struggle to survive, Iroan's entire being seemed to pulse with recognition, with something that looked impossibly like worship, and he nodded slowly, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire ship with its gravity. "Yes, Jesus, the convergence point, the moment when your Creator did what no civilization in 100 galaxies believed possible, compressed the fullness of divine love into human DNA, walked in the dust of Earth, felt hunger and joy and sorrow and pain, all to prove that no separation between God and humanity was permanent, that love could build a bridge across any abyss." I pressed my hands against the floor to steady myself. My mechanic's fingers splayed across technology that thrummed with purpose, and I realized I was touching something holy, that this alien ship carried the same sacred weight as any cathedral, any temple, any place where heaven had chosen to meet Earth. "You came here to witness him," I breathed, understanding, dawning like sunrise after the longest night. You and others like you. You were there. A Rowan knelt beside me then, his luminous form folding with a grace that defied the physics I understood, bringing those impossible eyes level with mine. And in them I saw reflected not just galaxies, but something more: compassion, brotherhood, the recognition of one soul seeing another across the vast distance between worlds. We were there, Daniel, watching from the margins of your history, hidden among the crowds and the wilderness, witnessing the impossible unfold. His voice carried the weight of memory, of testimony, of someone who had seen the face of God and survived the encounter transformed. And what we witnessed changed everything, not just for Earth, but for all of creation. Because in that moment when divinity and humanity became one, when God chose love over power, sacrifice over dominion, resurrection over the finality of death, the entire frequency of the universe shifted. His hand reached out, not touching me but hovering near my chest where he'd pressed earlier, and I could feel energy radiating from his palm like warmth from a fire on a cold desert night. You were chosen to repair this ship, to save my life, because you carry in your ordinary hands the same capacity for love that transformed everything, the willingness to heal what is broken, to give of yourself, without knowing the outcome, to participate in the restoration that is God's deepest desire for all of creation. And now you must know why. You must understand what your sacred texts have been trying to tell you all along. I stared at a Rowan, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to break free. And the question that had been building inside me finally broke through the surface, raw and desperate and more honest than anything I'd said in years. Why me? Why would you trust a broken-down mechanic who can barely keep his own life together with a truth this big, this impossible? The words tasted like confession, like admitting every failure that had led me to that desert town, every dream I'd buried under unpaid bills and sleepless nights, every moment I'd wondered if I mattered at all in the vast indifference of the universe. Aaron's expression shifted, something ancient and knowing moving behind those luminous eyes, and he tilted his head in a gesture that felt both alien and achingly familiar, like a teacher recognizing something in a student that the student couldn't yet see in himself. You believe yourself broken, Daniel, but I see a man who still reaches out to repair what others would abandon, who still says yes to the call of curiosity and courage when logic says run away, who carries in his very name the echo of a prophet who survived the lion's den by trusting what he could not see. His words washed over me like cool water in the endless heat, and I felt something crack open in my chest, something I'd sealed shut after too many disappointments. The ship around us responded to his emotion, the walls blooming with colors I had no names for, creating constellations that seemed to map not space but meaning itself, connecting points of light in patterns that told stories older than human language. He rose then, extending his hand to me, and when I took it, the contact sent a cascade of warmth through my entire body, not burning, but illuminating, like every cell was suddenly remembering something it had forgotten, some original instruction written into my DNA before fear and doubt had obscured it. Come, let me show you what your sacred texts have been protecting, the truth that has been hidden in plain sight for 2,000 years, waiting for hearts ready to understand. Aaron's voice carried a gravity that made the air itself feel heavier, more substantial, as if reality was thickening around his words, giving them weight and texture. He led me deeper into the ship, through passages that seemed to form as we walked, the technology responding to intention rather than mechanics. And I realized with a shock that ran through me like electricity that this was what matter looked like when it obeyed love instead of entropy, when creation aligned with the Creator's purpose instead of fighting against it. We entered a chamber that felt like stepping inside a living heart, walls pulsing with gentle rhythm, and in the center floated a sphere of light so pure, so concentrated, that looking at it made my eyes water even as something in my soul reached toward it with desperate hunger. This is a record keeper, Aaron explained, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried perfect clarity. A device that captures not just images, but truth itself, the spiritual frequency of events that reshape reality. And what I am about to show you has been witnessed by watchers across the cosmos. A testament preserved because what happened on Earth was never meant to be forgotten, never meant to be reduced to metaphor or myth, but understood as the most real thing that has ever occurred in this dimensional plane. He moved his hands through the air around the sphere, and symbols flowed from his fingers like music made visible, each gesture a command that the technology obeyed with something that looked disturbingly like reverence. And I found myself holding my breath, every nerve in my body alive with anticipation and something close to holy terror. You speak of Jesus as history, as religion, as belief system, Iroan said, his eyes fixed on the sphere as it began to pulse faster, brighter, responding to his touch like an instrument being tuned. But we know him as cosmic event, as the moment when the mathematics of love proved stronger than the equations of death, when the Creator demonstrated that the gap between infinite divinity and finite humanity was never unbridgeable, only unbridged until someone loved enough to cross it. The sphere suddenly expanded, enveloping us both, and I gasped as the chamber disappeared, replaced by visions so vivid I could smell the dust and blood, could feel the weight of sorrow hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. My kind does not worship as you understand worship, Daniel. We are observers, witnesses, scholars of the cosmic mystery. But when we speak of what happened here, even our ancient voices tremble. Iroan's words came from everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around me as the vision solidified, and I saw what no mechanic from a forgotten desert town should ever be privileged to see: the cross, the hill, the moment that split history into before and after, but surrounded by something the human witnesses couldn't perceive, beings of light standing in reverent silence, watching divinity bleed for love of what it had created. Tears streamed down my face unchecked as understanding crashed over me in waves that left me breathless, because I finally grasped what Iroan was trying to tell me, what his presence here meant, why a dying alien had whispered help to a nobody mechanic in the middle of nowhere. You didn't come to Earth to study us like specimens. You came because you recognized something happening here that your entire civilization had been searching for across galaxies and eons. My voice shook but grew stronger with each word, fed by a certainty that was blooming in my chest like sunrise. You came because God chose this place, this planet, these people, to demonstrate the answer to existence itself. That love isn't just a feeling or a force, but the fundamental architecture of reality. And Jesus wasn't just proving it to humanity, but to all of creation, every dimension, every world, every being that had ever wondered if the Creator truly cared about the created. Iroan turned to me within the vision, and for the first time I saw moisture in those alien eyes, something that looked heartbreakingly like tears, and his voice when he spoke carried the weight of someone confessing their deepest truth. Yes, Daniel. Yes, you understand now. You see what we have been protecting, what we have been trying to help humanity remember even as forces of darkness work to obscure it. That you are not alone in a cold universe, not abandoned on a meaningless rock, but central to a love story so vast that it encompasses galaxies. And your choice to believe or reject this truth ripples outward in ways you cannot imagine, affecting realities you will never see. Because every human soul that awakens to the reality of divine love becomes a beacon that pushes back the darkness just a little further. And that is why I came to you, why the ship crashed near your small garage in your forgotten town. Because there are no accidents in a universe where God is still writing the story. Only appointments we're free to keep or miss. The vision intensified around me until I couldn't tell where my body ended, and the experience began. And suddenly I was standing on that ancient hill, not as observer, but as participant, feeling the grief-soaked air press against my skin. While the sky above darkened with supernatural weight, I could see him there, suspended between heaven and earth, blood and divinity mingling in rivulets down, arms stretched wide enough to embrace a broken world, and my knees buckled under the raw physicality of it, the brutal reality that this was no sanitized religious painting but flesh, tearing, lungs struggling, love choosing agony over abandonment. But then Iroan's hand touched my shoulder, steadying me, and he whispered, "Look beyond the visible spectrum, Daniel. See what the human eye was not designed to perceive, but what was nonetheless present. Witness the assembly that gathered when God himself walked into death's domain, to break its authority forever." My vision shifted, expanded, as if a veil I hadn't known existed suddenly lifted, and I gasped as the hill exploded with presence. Beings of pure light standing in formation around the cross like an honor guard at the most important moment in cosmic history. They were not the cherubic angels of children's books, but towering presences of geometric complexity and overwhelming beauty, their forms shifting between solid and ethereal, their faces bearing expressions of such profound sorrow and fierce hope that I felt my heart would shatter from the intensity of their regard. Some were weeping, their tears falling like liquid starlight that vanished before touching the blood-soaked ground, while others stood with hands raised in gestures that looked like both worship and witness, recording everything for realms beyond my comprehension. I saw Iroan's people among them, watchers from distant worlds who had traveled impossible distances to stand vigil at this convergence point, their advanced understanding of physics and dimensional theory making them recognize what was happening here, as the universe itself held its breath. What you are witnessing is the moment of cosmic recalibration. Iron's voice resonated through the vision, educational yet reverent, the tone of someone explaining a mystery that still moved him despite countless viewings, when the Son of God, fully divine yet fully human, carried not just the sins of humanity, but the weight of entropy itself, the decay and death that had infected creation. Since the first rebellion against love's primacy, I watched as darkness gathered around the cross. Like a living thing, shadows with teeth and malice, forces that existed in the spaces between dimensions where light had been exiled. And I understood with horrifying clarity that this was not theater but warfare. The ultimate confrontation between life and death, love and annihilation, God's plan and the chaos that sought to unmake it. The beings of light stood their ground as the darkness pressed closer, not intervening because this battle could only be won one way, through the voluntary sacrifice of perfect love facing the full consequence of corrupted free will, through divinity experiencing the ultimate separation so that humanity would never have to experience it eternally. Then Jesus spoke, his words from the cross cutting through dimensions like a sword through silk, and I heard them not just in Aramaic, but in frequencies that translated across every language in the universe. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And the shockwave of that forgiveness rolled outward like a tsunami of light, washing over the assembled beings who fell to their knees in response to such incomprehensible mercy. I saw worlds I had no names for suddenly brighten as that wave reached them, saw darkness recoil in systems millions of light years away, saw chains breaking on souls imprisoned in dimensions where hope had died millennia ago, all because one man on one cross in one moment chose love over vengeance, redemption over condemnation, and proved that God's nature was not the cruel indifference the cosmos had feared, but passionate, pursuing, unrelenting grace. This is why we came, why we have never left, Iroan said, his voice thick with emotion that transcended species, and I turned to see tears now flowing freely down his luminous face, each drop glowing with its own internal light before dissolving into particles that floated upward like prayers made visible. My people had mapped 1,000 galaxies, mastered technologies your world won't discover for centuries, built civilizations that rose and fell while your planet was still cooling from creation. But we had never encountered anything like this, had never seen the Creator enter his own creation not as conqueror, but as sacrifice, not to demonstrate power but to prove love. The vision shifted again, and I saw the moment of death, that terrible instant when the light of the world went dark, when the God-man released his spirit, and every being assembled there felt that the vision pulled me deeper still, past the crucifixion moment and into something my mind struggled to categorize, a space between death and resurrection where time itself seemed to bend under the weight of what was transpiring, and Iron's hand remained on my shoulder like an anchor keeping me from dissolving into the overwhelming magnitude of what I was witnessing. You must understand, Daniel. He spoke with the careful precision of someone translating concepts that had no earthly equivalent. That Jesus was not merely a good teacher who met a tragic end, not simply a prophet among many, but a deliberate incursion of the divine into the molecular structure of your reality, a bridge built from both sides of an impossible chasm. I felt his words reverberating in my chest cavity, each syllable carrying weight that pressed against my ribs, and suddenly the scene before me shifted into something that looked like DNA helixes made of light, spiraling and interweaving with human genetic code. And I gasped as I recognized what I was seeing, the biological impossibility of God becoming flesh, divinity compressing itself into chromosomes and cells without losing any of its infinite nature. Your scientists speak of wave-particle duality, Iroan continued, his voice carrying that strange harmony of advanced intellect and childlike wonder, how light can be both energy and matter depending on observation. But they have barely glimpsed the greater truth that consciousness itself shapes reality, that the observer creates through observation, and that when God chose to observe humanity from within humanity, the entire equation of existence shifted. The genetic spirals transformed before my eyes into doorways, thousands upon millions of them stretching into infinity like a cosmic honeycomb, and through each door I could see different versions of reality, dimensions stacked upon dimensions where the fundamental constants of physics, varied just enough to create entirely different expressions of existence, and my mind reeled trying to comprehend the scope of what Erowin was showing. Me, before Jesus, these dimensions were isolating, separating, each realm locked in its own frequency with no way to bridge the gaps that entropy and rebellion had created, Erowin explained, gesturing toward the vast array of doorways with a movement that seemed to encompass universes. But the incarnation changed everything because Jesus carried both natures simultaneously, both the frequency of heaven and the frequency of earth, creating a resonance that could harmonize all others. I watched in stunned silence as a single figure appeared, walking among the doorways with nail-scarred hands extended, and everywhere he touched the barriers grew thin, permeable, as if his very presence was rewriting the rules about what could connect with what, who could reach whom. And I understood with sudden clarity why Erowin kept using words like designed and engineered. This was not random chance or mythological metaphor, but intentional architecture on a scale that made our greatest cathedrals look like children's blocks, a plan conceived before atoms learned to dance, executed with precision that accounted for every variable across every possible timeline, all to accomplish one impossible goal: bringing separated creation back into relationship with its creator without violating the free will that made that relationship meaningful. Do you see now why we call him a cosmic event? Erowin asked, turning me gently to face him, his eyes reflecting star systems I had no names for, and in their depths I saw reverence that transcended any religious ceremony I had ever attended, a worship born not from blind faith, but from comprehensive understanding that only magnified the mystery instead of diminishing it. My people can manipulate matter at the quantum level, can fold spacetime like origami, can extend consciousness across light years, but we cannot do what he did, cannot bridge the gap between infinite and finite without destroying one or the other in the process. His voice cracked with emotion that I felt in my own throat, and I realized I was crying again, tears streaming down my face as I finally grasped what he was telling me. That Jesus was not God pretending to be human or human pretending to be God, but the genuine article of both, fully and simultaneously, a paradox that should have torn reality apart, but instead became the seam that stitched it back together, the divine DNA you witnessed. Erowin continued, wiping at his own luminous tears, is not metaphorical language, but literal truth translated into terms your current science can begin approaching. The actual mechanism by which eternity clothed itself in mortality, by which love itself took on vulnerability, by which the uncreated entered creation as creator within creation, experiencing every limitation, every temptation, every pain that humanity suffers, proving that God understands not from distant observation, but from intimate participation in the struggle. The doorways behind us began to glow brighter, pulsing with synchronized light like a billion hearts beating in perfect rhythm. And Erowin placed both his hands on my shoulders now, his touch gentle despite the obvious power contained within his form, and his next words fell into my spirit like seeds into fertile soil, changing the very composition of my understanding. This is why the resurrection matters beyond just proving Jesus was special, Daniel, because when he walked out of that tomb with a body that could eat fish yet pass through walls, that could be touched yet transcend space, he was demonstrating the future prototype of all redeemed creation, showing what matter becomes when it is fully reconciled to its maker, when the divine DNA he introduced into human lineage through his incarnation reaches its full expression. I saw it. Then, the vision showing me billions of humans across time suddenly transformed into beings who looked like Erowin's people but distinctly human still, glorified flesh that retained its unique personality and history while gaining capabilities that my current form could barely imagine, and the beauty of it shattered something in my chest, some cynical barrier I had built against hope, because this was not annihilation of self or absorption into impersonal cosmic soup, but the ultimate fulfillment of everything humanity was always meant to become. He unlocked the door, paid the price that quantum physics and spiritual law both demanded, and now the connection is permanent, unbreakable. Erowin whispered as the vision slowly faded, returning us to the interior of his ship where I knelt trembling, forever changed by understanding that Jesus was not the end of God's interaction with humanity but the beginning, the key that opened every lock, the bridge that could never again be burned, the cosmic event whose shockwaves would ripple through reality until every dimension, every door, every separated soul found its way home to the love that engineered existence itself. The vision shifted once more, and I found myself standing in what looked like a tomb carved from ancient stone, the air thick with spices and grief, and my heart hammered against my ribs because I knew without being told that this was the third day, the moment when everything humanity believed about death was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Rowan stood beside me, his luminous form dimmed to a soft glow that didn't disturb the sacred darkness, and I could feel his anticipation like electricity in the air, the way the atmosphere charges before lightning strikes, and he whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "Watch now, Daniel, and understand that what you are about to witness is not supernatural magic defying natural law, but natural law being revealed in its complete form, the physics of resurrection that your science has not yet discovered because it requires understanding that love itself is a fundamental force of the universe." I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to demand explanations my mechanical mind could categorize and file away safely. But then the body on the stone slab began to glow from within, a light that started in the chest cavity where the spear had pierced and spread outward through veins and arteries like liquid sunrise, and I fell to my knees without deciding to, my legs simply refusing to hold me in the presence of what I was witnessing. The light intensified until I had to shield my eyes, and Aaron's hand found my shoulder again, steadying me as he spoke with a voice that trembled with joy. "He is doing it, breaking the dimensional prison, proving that death is not a wall but a door, and he holds the key forged from perfect love meeting perfect justice." Through my fingers I watched as the body of Jesus sat upright, and the wrongness of it hit me first because this was not resuscitation, not a heart restarting or lungs inflating, but something far more profound and terrifying and beautiful, like watching a caterpillar emerge from its chrysalis, except the scale was all wrong, cosmic, as if the entire universe was the cocoon and something new was being born. The wounds remained visible, glowing marks on hands and feet and side, but they were transformed now, no longer symbols of defeat but badges of victory, proof of a battle fought in realms I couldn't see, where the price for humanity's reconciliation had been paid in full. And I understood suddenly why Rowan called this a victory over entropy itself. "Death is not natural, Daniel," Rowan explained as we watched Jesus stand, his resurrection body somehow more solid and more ethereal simultaneously, existing in multiple dimensional frequencies at once in a way that made my mechanic's brain ache, trying to comprehend the engineering, entropy, decay, separation. These are symptoms of a broken system, a creation groaning under the weight of rebellion that severed the connection between matter and its maker. But Jesus entered that system willingly, experienced its full brutality, died its ultimate death, and then reversed the equation from the inside out. I saw it then as Rowan gestured, mathematical formulas appearing in the air, like sacred text, showing how love functioned as an opposing force to entropy, how self-sacrifice created energy instead of depleting it, how the willingness to die for another generated power that could tear through the fabric of death itself and emerge victorious on the other side. The tomb walls became transparent, and I gasped as I saw them. Thousands of beings like Rowan standing in concentric circles around the garden, witnesses to this cosmic moment, their faces illuminated with wonder and hope that transcended species or origin, and many were weeping as humans weep, their tears catching starlight as they fell. "We have watched worlds die, Daniel," Rowan said softly, his voice heavy with memories I couldn't begin to imagine, civilizations rising and falling across millennia, suns going cold and species facing extinction without hope of continuation beyond their brief flicker in the dark. We have seen entropy claim galaxy after galaxy, watched as the second law of thermodynamics marched everything toward heat, death, and dissolution, and we truly believed, that this was the inescapable fate of all physical existence, that consciousness itself was doomed to eventual silence. His hand tightened on my shoulder, and I felt him trembling, this being of immense knowledge and power shaking like a child who had witnessed a miracle beyond his wildest dreams. But then he walked out of that tomb, and instruments we had positioned throughout this solar system registered an event that should have been impossible, a localized reversal of entropy, a human body not just reanimated but glorified, matter infused with spirit in a stable configuration that our best scientists said violated everything we understood about how dimensions interact. And we finally knew, that love was not just a pleasant emotion but the fundamental force strong enough to defeat death itself. I watched Jesus appear to his followers, passing through locked doors and solid walls yet eating fish and bread, inviting doubting hands to touch his wounds, and each appearance sent ripples through reality that I could now perceive, waves of transformation spreading outward from his resurrection body like stones dropped in cosmic ponds. This is why we protect your world, why we have stationed watchers in your system since that morning, Iroan said as the vision began to fade, his words falling into my heart with the weight of solemn vows spoken before thrones I couldn't see. Because what happened here proved that God's plan included a solution to the entropy problem. That creation was not abandoned to slow decay but given a pathway to transformation. That every death could now become a doorway instead of a dead end. And that changed everything for 100 dying galaxies whose inhabitants watched and hoped and believed that if God could do this for humanity, perhaps the same love might reach them too. The tomb dissolved around us, returning us to the ship's interior. But I was changed now, marked by what I had witnessed. And as I knelt there weeping, I understood that resurrection was not just about Jesus proving he was special, but about Jesus proving that love defeats entropy, that sacrifice generates power, that death has genuinely lost its final victory, and that the universe itself was being invited into transformation that would never end because the God who entered death had walked back out carrying the keys, offering them freely to anyone willing to follow him through the door he had opened at such devastating cost, such infinite love, such unshakable commitment to redeeming everything he had made. I sat there in the silence that followed the vision of resurrection, my mind reeling from everything I had witnessed, and Iroan remained perfectly still beside me, allowing me to process what my small human consciousness could barely contain, when suddenly I felt compelled to ask the question that burned in my chest like hot metal. Why are you here, Iroan? Why did you crash near my shop of all places? In this forgotten desert town where nothing important ever happens? He turned to face me fully then, and his eyes held such compassion mixed with urgency that I felt my breath catch, and when he spoke his voice carried the weight of centuries of faithful watching. Daniel, we are here because what happened on that cross and in that tomb 2,000 years ago did not just change Earth's destiny. It sent a shockwave of hope through dimensions you cannot see, reaching dying civilizations that had resigned themselves to entropy's cold victory. And my kind, the Watchers, we were assigned by the Ancient of Days himself to guard this planet because it became ground zero for the greatest rescue operation the universe has ever witnessed. I watched as he gestured and the ship's walls displayed images of other worlds, beautiful planets orbiting distant stars, some with crystalline cities and others with organic architecture that grew like living things. And on each world I saw beings looking upward as if waiting for something, hoping for something. And my heart broke at the desperate longing I recognized in their alien faces, because it was the same longing I had carried my whole life before tonight. Iroan's voice softened as he explained, walking through the holographic displays of these faraway worlds like a teacher moving through a beloved classroom, and I followed him on unsteady legs, still wiping tears from my face as he spoke. When Jesus died and rose again, our instruments detected what we call a frequency shift, a change in the fundamental vibration of matter itself that originated from this planet and spread outward at speeds that transcended your physics understanding of light barriers. And within days of his resurrection we received messages from watchers stationed in systems hundreds of light years away, reporting the same phenomenon, this wave of transformative energy that seemed to whisper that death's grip had been broken. He paused before an image of a dying sun, its light flickering like a candle about to go out, and beings on the surrounding planets looking up in despair. And I felt their hopelessness in my gut because I had felt it too, during the darkest nights in my garage when bills were overdue and loneliness seemed like the only reliable companion. These civilizations, Daniel, they have technology that surpasses yours by millennia. They have solved problems of energy and space travel that your scientists still consider impossible. But they could not solve death, could not reverse entropy, could not find meaning in a universe that seemed designed to wind down into cold darkness. And then the signal came from Earth, from this unremarkable planet in an unremarkable galaxy, carrying the impossible message that love had defeated death, and that the Creator had not abandoned his creation, but had entered it to transform it from the inside out. The hologram shifted again, and I saw them now, beings like Iroan positioned throughout our solar system, stationed on moons and asteroids and in orbital platforms invisible to our telescopes, watching Earth with the dedication of guards protecting something infinitely precious. And Iroan's pride in his mission radiated from him like heat from forge-worked metal as he explained, We have been here since that first Easter morning, assigned by the Ancient of Days to protect this world, because what happened here is not finished, Daniel. The resurrection was not an ending but a beginning, the first fruit of a harvest that will eventually include every corner of creation, willing to accept the gift that Jesus purchased with his blood. I saw evidence then of their protection, asteroids deflected from collision courses, solar flares redirected, even human weapon systems mysteriously failing at critical moments when nuclear war seemed inevitable. And I understood that history as we knew it had been shaped by invisible hands working to preserve humanity long enough for God's plan to reach its completion. We do not interfere with your free will. That is sacred ground we dare not tread, because the entire point of Jesus' mission was to offer choice, not compulsion, love, not control. But we do protect against external threats and cosmic accidents that would end your species before the invitation to transformation has reached every ear, every heart, every person who might say yes to the door Jesus opened through his death and resurrection, Erowin said, and his voice carried such reverence when he spoke of Jesus that I knew beyond doubt that, whatever else this being was, he was a servant of the same God I had prayed to in my garage on lonely nights, the same God who had somehow arranged for an alien spaceship to crash behind my shop so that a broken mechanic might learn that his existence had always mattered in ways beyond comprehension. Erowin turned to me then and placed both hands on my shoulders, his touch warm and solid despite his otherworldly nature, and his eyes locked with mine as he delivered the words that would define the rest of my life. Daniel, you were not randomly chosen. No one ever is in the economy of God's grace. And I crashed here because you were meant to know this truth, to carry it back to your world with the authority of one who has seen beyond the veil and touched the edge of mysteries that most humans only glimpse in dreams or desperate prayers. I felt the weight of his words settling into my bones, becoming part of my structure like carbon and steel, and I wanted to protest that I was nobody, just a failed mechanic in a dying town with calloused hands and a high school education. But the words died in my throat because I saw in Erowin's eyes that God specialized in using nobodies, that the entire story of Jesus was about the Creator, choosing weakness to shame strength, foolishness to confound wisdom, and that my very ordinariness was precisely what qualified me to carry this testimony to a world that had heard too many polished sermons and needed instead the raw truth stammered out by someone who still had grease under his fingernails. We protect your world because it is holy ground, Daniel, sanctified by the blood of God himself spilled into its soil, and because every human born here carries the potential to become like Jesus, to have their mortal bodies transformed into resurrection bodies that exist in perfect harmony between matter and spirit, and that possibility, that glorious future that Jesus inaugurated and invites all to share, that is worth guarding with every resource at our disposal across all the ages, until he returns to complete what he began, Erowin said, and as his ship prepared to release me back to my ordinary life that would never be ordinary again, I understood finally that protection and purpose were two sides of the same coin, that the Watchers guarded Earth not because we were perfect, but because God loved us perfectly, and that love, that impossible resurrection love, was indeed the only force in all creation strong enough to hold back the darkness and promise dawn. The air inside the ship seemed to thicken as Erowin's expression shifted from compassion to something darker, more urgent, and I felt my stomach tighten with instinctive dread as he gestured toward the holographic display, where the images of distant worlds and faithful watchers dissolved into something that made my blood run cold. What appeared before me were figures cloaked in shadow moving through corridors of power on Earth, boardrooms in government, chambers and even religious institutions, and though I could not see their faces clearly, I could feel the wrongness radiating from them, like heat from rotten meat, a corruption that went deeper than mere human evil. Daniel, you must understand that not all who speak of God serve him, and not all who appear as angels of light actually come from the light, because the enemy of souls is ancient and cunning, and has spent millennia perfecting the art of deception, twisting truth just enough to poison it while keeping the appearance of righteousness, Erowin said, his voice carrying a weight that pressed against my chest like physical force. I watched in horror as the display showed ancient texts being edited, councils of religious leaders centuries ago debating which truths to emphasize and which to quietly bury, not always from evil intent, but often from fear that humanity could not handle the full cosmic scope of God's plan. And I saw how those small omissions and careful edits had compounded over generations until the glorious truth of Jesus as a cosmic event had been reduced in many minds to mere moral philosophy or social reform. The images shifted again, and I saw darker figures now, beings that looked almost like Erowyn, but with something fundamentally wrong in their essence, a kind of anti-light that seemed to devour hope rather than kindle it, and I knew without being told that these were the fallen ones, those who had rejected their assignment and now worked to keep humanity locked in ignorance and despair because our awakening to our true identity in Christ threatened their diminishing kingdoms of shadow and lies. Erowyn moved closer to me as the visions continued, his presence somehow protective even as my mind reeled from the implications of what I was seeing, and his voice took on the tone of a commander briefing a soldier before a dangerous mission. They want to erase the truth of what Jesus accomplished, not by denying his existence outright, because that strategy failed centuries ago when the evidence was too fresh and the witnesses too numerous, but by reducing him to something manageable, something that does not threaten their control or challenge humanity's comfortable slavery to material reality and death's supposed finality. I saw then how the strategy worked in layers, some forces promoting aggressive atheism and scientific materialism that dismissed any reality beyond what could be measured in laboratories, while others pushed versions of spirituality so vague and self-centered that they required nothing of their adherents except pleasant feelings and the illusion of enlightenment without transformation. There are human institutions that have been compromised, Daniel, not all of them but enough, where leaders, more concerned with maintaining power and wealth than serving truth, have made accommodations with forces they do not fully understand, accepting money and influence from sources that ultimately serve the ancient enemy of your souls, Erowyn continued, and I felt sick as I recognized some of the symbols and buildings in his display, places that claimed to represent God, but had somewhere along the way traded his glory for earthly security and respectability. The most disturbing revelation came when Erowyn showed me certain elements within governments and corporations who had made contact with non-terrestrial beings, but not watchers like him, instead with those fallen ones who offered advanced technology and power in exchange for cooperation in keeping humanity distracted, divided, and ignorant of their true heritage as children of the God who had defeated death itself. Through Jesus Christ, I wanted to look away but forced myself to keep watching because I understood that this warning was not given to paralyze me with fear, but to prepare me for the resistance I would face when I tried to share what I had learned tonight. In this impossible ship in the desert canyon behind my failing garage, the holographic display shifted one final time, and now I saw myself, or rather I saw possible futures branching out from this moment like roads diverging in infinite directions, and in some of those futures I remained silent about what I had witnessed, returning to my ordinary life and letting the memory fade into something I could dismiss as a dream or breakdown. And I watched those versions of me grow old in quiet desperation, haunted by the truth I had refused to speak. But in other futures I saw myself standing in small churches and living rooms, sitting across tables in coffee shops and speaking to strangers in parking lots, telling this impossible story with shaking voice and inadequate words. And I saw how some listeners laughed and others grew angry, and many simply walked away shaking their heads at the crazy mechanic who claimed aliens had told him about Jesus. But then I saw the ones who listened with hunger in their eyes, the ones who had been waiting their whole lives for confirmation that their faith was not wishful thinking, but connection to a reality more solid than the ground beneath their feet. They will call you deluded, Daniel. They will say you are mentally ill or seeking attention or have been deceived by demons. And some of those accusations will come from people who claim to follow Jesus, but whose faith has become so small and domesticated that they cannot recognize his hand at work outside their approved theological boxes, Erowyn said, and his voice carried both sadness and fierce pride as he continued. But you were chosen, precisely because you are ordinary, because your life offers no platform or credentials that could explain away your testimony as anything other than what it is, an encounter with truth that refuses to stay silent no matter the cost. I saw in those futures the loneliness that would come with this calling, the relationships that would strain and break under the weight of what I now knew. But I also saw the eyes of those who would hear and believe, and find their faith expanded to encompass the cosmic scope of God's love. And I knew with terrible clarity that Erowyn was right, that I had been chosen not randomly, but specifically, and that the rest of my life would be defined by whether I had the courage to speak truth to a world that had forgotten how to listen for God's voice. In unexpected places, as the visions faded and the ship's walls returned to their luminous solidity, Rowan stood before me one last time and spoke words that I would repeat to myself in every moment of doubt and fear that followed. You are not alone in this, Daniel, because the Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead lives in all who say yes to his invitation. And that same Spirit will give you words when you have none and courage when yours fails, and will confirm your testimony in the hearts prepared to receive it by the same God who prepared you to carry it. He reached out and touched my forehead with one finger, and I felt something like electricity, but warmer, kinder, flowing through my skull and down my spine, not changing who I was, but awakening something that had always been there, waiting for this moment of activation, this commissioning for a mission I had never applied for, but that fit me perfectly nonetheless. Remember that what Jesus accomplished was not just for earth, but for all creation, that his death and resurrection opened a door that had been locked since the ancient rebellion, and that every person who walks through that door by faith becomes a living demonstration that God's love is stronger than entropy, more enduring than stars, more powerful than all the forces of darkness combined across all dimensions and all time, Rowan said, his voice thick with emotion that transcended his alien nature, and revealed the devoted servant of the Ancient of Days that he truly was. I understood then with sudden clarity that my encounter tonight was itself a small echo of the Incarnation, God using the unexpected and seemingly inappropriate to reveal truth that the qualified and credentialed had missed, and that my testimony would be powerful not despite my ordinariness, but because of it, because God had always specialized in using foolish things to shame the wise and weak things to overcome the strong, and a grease-stained mechanic stammering about aliens. And Jesus was exactly the kind of unlikely messenger that bore the unmistakable signature of divine orchestration, that could not be faked or manufactured by human religious systems that had long ago learned to produce only what they could control and explain. The ship's door opened and I stumbled out into the cold desert night, my legs barely holding me as the craft behind me began to glow with increasing intensity, humming with a sound that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. And I turned to look back at Rowan one final time as he stood in the doorway backlit by that impossible light, his form somehow both alien and angelic, and he raised one hand in a gesture that was unmistakably a blessing, a commissioning, a sending forth of someone who had been forever marked by an encounter with truth that transcended every boundary I had previously believed separated heaven from earth, spirit from matter, God from his creation. The ship rose silently into the star-filled sky, moving with a grace that defied physics as I understood them, and I watched it accelerate upward until it became just another point of light among thousands, indistinguishable from the stars that had witnessed this impossible night. And then it was gone, and I was alone in the canyon behind my garage with nothing but the disturbed sand and the transformed landscape of my soul as evidence that any of this had actually happened. My knees buckled and I fell forward onto the desert floor, hands pressing into the still warm earth where the ship had rested, and the tears came then. Not tears of sadness or even joy, but something deeper and more primal. The tears of a man who had seen behind the curtain of reality and discovered that everything he had dismissed or doubted or held at arm's length was not only true, but more magnificently true than the diminished versions he had been offered by a world that had forgotten how to think big enough to contain the God who had spoken galaxies into existence and then loved humanity enough to enter our suffering as one of us. I do not know how long I knelt there in the sand, minutes or hours. Time had become strange and fluid in the aftermath of what I had witnessed, but eventually I became aware of the silence around me, not an empty silence but a full one, pregnant with presence, and I understood that I was not alone even though Rowan had departed, because the spirit he had spoken of was here, had always been here, was in fact woven into every atom of creation, waiting for eyes willing to see and hearts willing to receive the impossible love that had chased humanity since the garden and had finally caught us at a Roman cross where God had bled human blood to prove that no separation between creator and creation was too great for him to bridge. I lifted my face to the stars and felt the weight of what I now carried, this testimony that would sound like madness to most ears, this story of angels and aliens and Jesus as a cosmic event that had rewritten the rules of death across 100 galaxies, and I felt the fear of it, the certainty that my life would never be simple again, that I would lose friends and credibility and the comfortable anonymity of being just another struggling mechanic in a town too small for anyone to notice or care what happened here. But underneath the fear was something stronger, a peace that made no logical sense given what lay ahead, a confidence that came not from my own courage, which was in desperately short supply, but from the unshakable reality that I had been chosen for this, that my small life had always been pointing toward this moment, and that the same God who had orchestrated the incarnation and resurrection was fully capable of making a way for this testimony to reach the ears that needed to hear it. Regardless of how inadequate I felt as the messenger, I stood slowly, brushing the sand from my jeans with hands that still trembled slightly, and I looked back toward my garage sitting dark and silent at the canyon's edge, that building full of broken engines and unpaid invoices that had represented the sum total of my concerns just hours ago. And it looked different now, not because it had changed, but because I now saw it as part of the intricate tapestry of circumstances that had prepared me for tonight. Every failure and disappointment and lonely evening working late on machines that at least made sense when nothing else in life did, all of it forming the exact shape of person who could receive what Rowan had shared without the barriers of theological expertise or scientific certainty getting in the way. I thought of the visions he had shown me, those possible futures branching out from this moment, and I felt myself choosing consciously now the path of speaking, even knowing the cost, because I had seen the faces of those who would hear and believe and find their small faith suddenly exploded into cosmic proportions, and I knew that even if I reached only one person with this impossible story, it would be worth every moment of ridicule and rejection that came with it. The words Rowan had spoken echoed in my mind about Jesus being not just a teacher, but a convergence point of divine and human that had unlocked something fundamental in the structure of reality itself. And I felt a fierce love rising in my chest for this cosmic Christ, who was somehow both the humble carpenter from Nazareth that I had learned about in childhood, Sunday school, and the universal Lord whose death and resurrection had sent shockwaves of hope through galaxies I could not name and would never see with human eyes. I walked back toward my garage as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, each step feeling significant in a way I had never experienced before, as though I was walking not just across desert sand, but across a threshold into a life defined by mission rather than survival, by truth rather than comfort, by faith that God's plan was so much bigger and more beautiful than anything human religion had managed to capture in our systematic theologies and careful doctrines that too often protected us from the wild, dangerous love of a God who refused to stay confined in our expectations. I knew that tomorrow I would begin the work of finding words for what I had experienced, that I would stumble and fail and try again to communicate the incommunicable, that I would face skepticism from believers and unbelievers alike. But I also knew with unshakable certainty that I was not doing this alone, that the Spirit Rowan had promised was already giving me courage I did not naturally possess and would provide words when my own failed and would prepare hearts to receive this testimony in ways I could not orchestrate or manufacture, no matter how eloquent I became. As I reached the garage door and paused to look back one more time at the canyon where everything had changed, I whispered a prayer of thanks to the God who had loved me enough to shatter my small safe world with a truth too large to contain, and I felt his pleasure wash over me like warm light, confirmation that my yes to this impossible calling was exactly what he had been waiting for, and that my life from this moment forward would be spent as a witness to the reality that Jesus Christ had not just saved humanity, but had rewritten the rules of existence itself, proving once and for all that love was stronger than death, that hope was more powerful than entropy, and that every human being, no matter how ordinary or broken, was invited into a story that spanned dimensions and would echo through eternity long after the stars themselves had grown cold and dark. Could everything you thought you knew about faith be smaller than the truth God wants to reveal to you? Subscribe to hear more testimonies that will expand your understanding of God's cosmic plan.